Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining this talk on mainstreaming democratic education. And so I'm going to start off with a question of why. Why do we need to be concerned about mainstreaming democratic education at all? And a few things. First of all, at least I think most of us live in societies that describe as democratic. But in all of these societies, democratic education is called alternative. So this does not make sense. If a society is democratic, then every aspect of that society should be democratic, including education. So if we are not the mainstream, and we are somewhere in the sidelines as one of many alternatives, then something somewhere is wrong. So either the people who come to IDEC every year are a bunch of lunatics and should be ignored, or we are really onto something, but we have failed to really establish ourselves. So I'm going on the assumption that it's the second thing and not that we are a bunch of loonies, I hope. Carl already mentioned it in his session as well, just before mine. What we identify as democratic education is more than 100 years old. This gathering as IDEC is more than 30 years old. But still, Martin also mentioned this yesterday, that although at IDEC it seems like we are so many, if you look at it overall, we are still so few. We are a niche. And many democratic schools are struggling. Some are even closing down. At the same time, mainstream schools are becoming increasingly authoritarian, right? And I put a little asterisk there because, okay, who is saying this? Is it me saying this? On what basis am I saying this? So I'll come back to my evidence for this later. And the theme for this year's IDEC is about a culture of dialogue, but there is no culture of dialogue between the democratic schools and the mainstream schools. Like, we are in our little enclave, they are doing their thing, and there is no sharing or communication happening. Or there may be isolated incidents, but not enough. I think there needs to be more. So the net result of this is that fewer and fewer children are experiencing education that is consistent with democratic principles. So again, how do I say whether it's consistent or not? That's the part that I'm going to come to. And this point was also mentioned by Carl and Olivia in their session earlier. The number of people living in societies that can be described as democratic is reducing. And I think this is because democracy as a way of living together as nation states is quite a new experience for human civilization. And in that experiment, we have failed to make the way education is provided to young people in the mainstream democratic. So we actually have a large number of children going through a very undemocratic experience for, 13 years, 15 years, and then they become adults, and we are expecting them to live and function in a democratic society. I think that's not reasonable. Like, how do you know what it looks like to be in a democracy if you've not experienced democracy in your formative years? So I think part of the reason why democracy in the world is at risk is because our education systems have not been democratic enough. So why we need to mainstream this is, on one side, for our survival and growth as democratic schools, but also I think this is something needed in the world, and we have, maybe as a democratic education community, not done well enough in getting this message out there. And of course, there are reasons for that, so we'll come to that in a moment as well. So I had this survey. As of lunchtime, I had only 11 responses, so maybe it's not statistically significant enough, and I hope I'll have more responses later. But 7 of those 11 were legally recognized as a school, but it's not an easy process. So we are spending a lot of our time dealing with inspectors, meeting bureaucratic requirements, and less time than actually working with young people and providing democratic education. 4 of them were receiving public funding, and out of that 3 is from Germany, which is a kind of a special case, I think, in the democratic education world because of how the right to start a school is there in the constitution. So once you start a school, you can get the funding, but actually starting the school is still very difficult. 5 of the schools have either closed or are struggling either due to financial or bureaucratic reasons. And in terms of the challenges they face or the evidence they have to provide, 4 said they have to show that, this 8-year-old has to show that they can read at the level of other 8-year-olds or know maths at the same level or things like that, which doesn't quite go with the democratic approach of letting them learn when they're ready to learn. Like, how can you say that you can choose what you want to do, but by this age you need to be able to do this? Or they have to go with whatever imposed curriculum there is. So again, like you can choose what your learning is going to be as long as it's this curriculum. So it doesn't make sense, right? And various sort of legal or bureaucratic challenges, including attendance. So, for me, I think part of a democratic approach is that I should be able to choose whether I am attending school or not. So if I have to attend school, then there is a problem there. I would summarize it actually by saying we are illegitimate. Not legal. Right? And this is literally because it's a struggle to be legally accepted by whatever education system we have, and to fulfill the criteria that are demanded of us. So we spend, in the places that are legal, a lot of time doing the paperwork and the reporting, and some of those things are not even consistent with what we believe democratic education to be. And even in a figurative sense, the mainstream and the policymakers, the academics, they are not having a cultural dialogue with us. So for example, there is in every country some kind of dialogue going on about education policy, and I don't think democratic education, democratic school is invited to participate in that and say, you guys are doing great things, tell us more how we can do this. We are not visible. Mainstream schools are not coming to us and saying, hey, can you help us to be more democratic? And if they're not doing that, I think there is a gap there. So we wrote to some people, you may or may not recognize the names of these professors, Laura Lundy, Garrison Lansdowne, and Ton Leoford. We told them there's this conference happening in Belgium, and can you come? And no response. It's like a black hole. It's not even like, okay, you guys are doing something really great, but I cannot make it on this date, but let's keep in touch. Nothing like that. It's just like the email went into a black hole, and there's, again, no dialogue with these people. I'll come back to who they are later. Okay, very specific example. In the UK, there's a bill called the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill. So the title of the bill has children's well-being in it, but several psychologists wrote an open letter to the Secretary of State for Education saying this is going to make children's mental health worse. What you're proposing to do is going to make things worse than it already is. And they say, look, these are successful alternative approaches. But they don't talk about Summerhill, they don't talk about Derry Hannum's 20% proposal, they don't talk about any of the democratic education people in England who have been part of IDEC. So why are we not visible? And together these things mean that it's hard for us to recruit families, it's hard for us to recruit staff, then we are not financially sustainable, and then we can't show the results that the system is expecting us to show. So it's a kind of downward spiral that it's hard to get out from. So a legal problem requires a legal solution, which means that if the law does not support democratic education, we must change the law, right? But most of us don't have the time and money to spend in court battles. I know some people in the IDEC community have faced that. Summerhill had that. The Sudbury School in MSc had it. Peter Hartkamp had it. Most of us don't want to deal with it. I mean, we want to do some stuff with the children. We don't want to be spending our time in court. So where do we have the time and money to lobby Parliament to change the law? But as our friend Derry Hannam always asks us, another way is possible. Or is it? Let's see. I would like to make a proposal that when we answer the question, what is democratic, we take that to mean centered on human rights, right? And I'll go through in a bit why I am proposing this. So first, let's take countries. Forget schools, just countries. And whether we describe a country as democratic or not is not only about whether they have a representative system of government. Like 20 years ago in Sri Lanka, yes, we had representative governments, but if you were critical of the government in power, then you might disappear, right? And thereafter, there's no critical people anymore. So I think most of us would not consider it to be democratic if we didn't actually have multi-party elections that are free and fair and supported by a range of things. Democratic is also much more than whether we call ourselves democratic. So for example, I find it quite confusing how former East Germany was the German Democratic Republic. And still North Korea is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So just because you put the name democratic in the country doesn't mean it's actually a democracy. But who decides this? I mean, can I criticize North Korea and say, you guys are not democratic, why are you having this in your name? I think actually it should be the people of North Korea who decide whether their system of government is democratic or not. And in order to decide that, of course, they need to have the visibility to see what's happening in other countries, which isn't always the case when the country is not democratic. So I would say that democracy is a way of life based on certain loosely defined ideals, like we talk about dignity, we talk about freedom, we talk about participation, equality. So equality is where each person has the same vote and things like that. But how do we know if those things are actually in place or not is then it gets formalized into law. So we have constitutional law that defines our fundamental rights. So there is, I think, in most countries, something in the constitutional rights that will say you have a right to freedom of expression, so you can criticize your government and not have to disappear. And we also have that in international human rights law. So since 1948, this has been part of a big shift that helped that sort of experiment towards a democratic way of life. So the ideals are there in a generic sort of sense, but how do we say these ideals are actually there in practice is because they are formalized in law, and there is a way for people to say that when this incident happened, my right to freedom of movement was violated, or my right to freedom of religion was violated, and therefore the state has done wrong and I need some solution for this. So in the same line, democratic is then not a binary. It's not that these countries are democratic and these countries are not democratic. It's rather, you could say that these countries are more democratic for ABCD reasons and these countries are less democratic because they don't have those things. And then we might say that compared to 3 years ago, this country is now less democratic because these changes have happened. So for every country, this experiment of living in a democratic way is a work in progress. So there are people there's opportunities for every country to do better. There are people in those countries, human rights defenders, who will argue and protest about rights violations happening, or they'll say that when you introduce this law, this is violating our rights, things like that. And there are surveys, I know Pew Research is one of them, where they do analysis of different countries. They talk about the freedom of the press, whether there is rule of law, things. So people in the countries can look and say that, hey, we have got worse than we were last year, so we need to do something about this so that information enables the human rights defenders to do things. And one more part on this, which I think is not very much common knowledge, but for every international human rights treaty that a country ratifies, there is a reporting process to the international community. So every 4, maybe 5 years, we have to say, this is what we promised to do last time, these are some of the things we have done, these are the things still to do. And so for example, Sri Lanka committed in 2018 to abolish corporal punishment in schools, because right now it's still legal. And they have been very slow at it, but at least it's provided a way for child rights defenders to pressure the government and say, you made this promise and now you need to do these things, right? And if you don't do these things, then the international community can also pressure the country and say, hey guys, you promised to do this thing, and if you're not going to do this, then maybe we are not going to be friends with you anymore. And particularly in cases like trading with the European Union, whether we get GSP plus or not also depends on whether we fulfill those things. So let's take the same analysis to education. So then democratic is more than whether decisions are made based on students voting. Especially if they're only voting on trivial matters, or if there is a curated choice and that it's like, okay, you have to do maths, do you want to do it at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock? And let's vote, right? Or if they cannot be critical about these things, like why can we only vote on these things, why can't we vote on those things? And if you speak about that, if you're going to end up being sent out of the school, then you don't have freedom of expression, so it's not very democratic. Just the fact that voting is happening is not good enough. And like with countries, just the title doesn't, I think, mean a lot. Right? But again, it's a question of who should decide that. I mean, can I look at what school X is doing and say, oh, this is not democratic or this is democratic? I mean, what right do I have to make that evaluation? I think if at all, that evaluation has to be made by the rights holder, which is the children. And like the example of North Korea, for that they need to see what is happening in other schools, and then they can say like, you know, if they can do it that way, we can do it that way too. And so we want this, and we are not happy without this. So again, I would say, just like with the countries, democratic education is also based on certain loosely defined ideals. So we talk about self-determination, we talk about freedom, self-direction, participation, equality. But how do we know those things are there? What is the way that it is formalized or standardized so that we can compare and say, do we have this or not? And like with the countries, democratic is also not a binary. I think every school, whether we call ourselves democratic or not, has opportunities to be more democratic. Which of those is most important? Which of those do we have money for? Do we have time for? That is a decision that that community needs to make, but I think all of us do have opportunities. But for countries, we saw there is the surveys, there is the pressure groups, there is the reporting mechanism, all of those things, but for education, we don't have that. So Don likes to call this the political problem. He has a session on Tuesday where he'll talk more about the technical problem, the marketing problem, and the political problem, and how we need to solve all three of them. But for my part, I'm talking about the political side of it. So I think we can say that many stakeholders in education are not happy with the state of education now. What they are unhappy about varies, but there is a lot of unhappiness. And education, of course, is a lot more than schooling, but for most children, school is the place where education happens. And I am making a claim, or rather I'm citing a claim, that schools, mainstream schools as they are now, are structurally violent. They are violent by the design, by the structure. Right? And again, I'll come to the evidence for this later. And a lot of people are trying to do something different, something better. People in democratic education are trying to do different things. People in mainstream schools are trying to do different things. People like UNICEF are trying to do different things. But that mainstream system has so much inertia. It's so big, it's so powerful that these influences are not enough to change it. These influences don't really have a common voice in terms of what is the change we're trying to achieve. Because if somebody is saying, well, we think we need to have more participation of children in their education, and somebody else is like, no, we don't want any of that, we just want to increase math scores. So how can we have a conversation? Then we're not even agreed on what we're trying to achieve. And I would also claim that not all of these supposed improvements are actually improvements. So these days, there's this book on the anxious generation. A lot of schools are banning devices, banning social media, and things like that. In my perspective, that is not an improvement. There are also schools that are reducing the amount of time for play so that children can do better in exams. Again, I think this is not an improvement. But again, why should anybody listen to me? Right? I'm just one of these crazy guys who meets at this IDEC conference every year. Right? So we need something more legitimate to make these claims on. But anyway, the political problem needs a political solution. And so we need some kind of standard by which we can assess, is this an improvement, and how much of an improvement is it? Some way to compare or to benchmark. And this has to be reasonably well articulated in the sense that it can't be really vague like dignity. Because what does that mean? But it also can't be like really detailed where it just becomes inaccessible. So it has to have room to adapt to different situations. So the reality of, let's say, a school in Belgium and a school in Sri Lanka where corporal punishment is still happening is going to be different. So I would expect, I would hope that getting rid of corporal punishment would be more of a priority for children. And maybe in Belgium it doesn't matter. But the children in Belgium would have other priorities, and we need to have something that works for all these cases. And the standards need to have universal acceptance. So if we go and say that, okay, children need to be more involved in their decision making, and the government is like, well, who are you to come and tell us this? Then it's not going to work. Because the government is too big, and we are too small. So there has to be some legitimate basis for this, legitimate across many countries if it is to work for all of the countries that are part of IDEC. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And lastly, we need some way that this can be mainstream, so that if there's something happening in school X, that it can spread quickly to school Y. It should not take 10 years for, let's say, sociocracy as a practice in one school to be spread to another school. I think it's quite possible to do it much faster than that. So how do we do this? So interesting thing is that that standard exists. International human rights law can be that standard. If human rights can underpin every aspect of a democratic society, from governance to healthcare to economics, it can also do the same for education. And these are well articulated. So if you take children's rights, the UNCRC as law has a quite comprehensive collection of rights. Then the general comments take it into more detail. This is how you should interpret this in this context. And then there are other supporting declarations and programs around this that give us the necessary amount of detail. And I'll show you some examples on that soon. And governments can't just ignore this. So if you take self-determination theory, and you say this is a research that has been done by this, the government could say, like, we are not obliged to look at this research. But except for the United States, every member country of the United Nations has ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So it's not so easy for governments to just ignore this. I mean, they will try, because if it's not convenient, they will try to ignore it, but we can make claims against it, and it's much harder for governments to shut us down when we can say that this is happening because of this right, and you need to listen to this. And specifically on the mainstreaming, there has been a proposal that has been approved by the United Nations General Assembly for a quality assurance system on human rights that can help mainstream human rights practices in education. So all of these things that we need are there. But it won't do anything unless we start using it, which is what I'm hoping that we will do after this presentation. So, to back up my claim about how democratic education is aligned with human rights, when we talk about self-determination or participation in decision-making, there is something on the rights of the child about the right to be heard on every decision that affects the child. And education is obviously something that hugely, hugely affects the child. We are spending like 13 years in this, and we are, as a world, spending trillions of dollars on this. This is important things. And how can we say we do not have to listen to young people on this? And I'll give some specific examples on the right to be heard in a bit. So I think most democratic schools do not enforce a segregation by age. We don't say, you're 8 years old, you're here, you're 10 years old, you're here. You can mix. It's up to you whether you want to stay with these people or not. And that is part of freedom of association, and the child's right to freedom of association is exactly the same as adults' right to freedom of association. So if we are insisting for no really good reason other than it's convenient for the adults, that these 8-year-olds are in this classroom, these 9-year-olds are in this classroom, then it is a violation of a child's right to freedom of association. And unless you can show that it is actually in the best interest of the child to do so, we shouldn't be doing that. We are just doing it actually because it's the historical practice. If you are not enforcing uniforms on children, that is because we are respecting children's right to freedom of expression. If we have free play, and I hope all democratic schools have free play, that is because we are respecting children's right to play. And this is not this abomination that some people called play-based learning, which is where it's something like, in order to learn financial management, you're going to play Monopoly. Right? And at the end of playing Monopoly, you have to tell me how you have learned financial management. So that is adult-directed something, but it's not play, because the rights discourse is quite explicit that if it's play, then it is not adult-directed. Sometimes we have to enforce a curriculum because that is part of the conditions under which we are legal, but if we have the opportunity to not enforce a curriculum, that is because we are respecting freedom of thought and conscience, freedom of expression. So freedom of expression includes the right to seek and receive information without frontiers. So like if a child in a school in Sri Lanka were to say, I want to know what's happening in Palestine, the child would probably be told, don't worry about this, don't bother about this, it's not going to come for your exam, you should study these things. And that is limiting the child's opportunities to learn about things that they care about. Right? And plus the right to be heard. So if the child is saying, I want to learn about these things, then we should, as much as possible, support that or facilitate that. Then if, as adults, we have made a decision to ban devices, then we are not respecting children's rights in the digital environment. Right? Now, all of these things are really about whether it's enforced or not. So it's not about a particular practice, it is about whether it is consensual. So if you take sex, if you take having sex, whether it's acceptable or not depends on whether the parties involved are consenting to it. So if there's consent, it's fine. If it's the exact same act without consent, then it's rape. So we can't, for example, it's not about whether there is a lecture or whether there is a working group or whether there is play. Because right now this is more or less a lecture and you all have consented to come and listen to it, so it's fine. But if somebody was forcing you to sit here and listen to this lecture, then I think it's not fine because your consent has not been respected. So, in some countries, like Sri Lanka, like England, and maybe more, if a child does not follow the uniform code, even if it's some really minor thing like the color of the shoelaces or how the hair is tied, then the child is punished. And in Sri Lanka, it can even be corporal punishment. So obviously this is not consensual. So in that sort of a setup, having a uniform is a problem. But if the participants freely agree that, no, we kind of like this idea of having uniform, then when we go out we can see who we are, we are more visible, we like to have a uniform, then it's fine. So for example, we talk about whether the schedules are made by the children or by the adults. And I think again it matters on the consent. So if the children say we like to do these kind of things, but we really don't want to be making the timetables, can you do this for us? We trust you, please do it. Or even something like teaching to the test. If a child were to say, and this was actually my situation when I was doing my final exams in school, I am right now not worried about whether I learned the subject or not. I am worried about can I get enough marks to get to university. So I want you to teach to the test so I can get good marks. Right? Now, whether a child should be in that situation or not is, I think, a different matter that needs to be dealt with. But if in this moment the child is saying that I really need to get to university and I need to pass this exam, please help me pass this exam by teaching to the test, then I think in that circumstance that is what we should do. Right. Now, if all of these things that are there in human rights law that we are upholding in democratic education, even if we don't use that language, why is it there in the mainstream system? Why are we not having conversations about this? Why are we not having conversations about how having detention for children is a violation of children's rights, or when children are shamed by behavior charts because these are the good children, they're up in the clouds, and these are the bad children with the red stars or whatever it is, and we are shaming them, which is a form of mental violence. Why are there no conversations about this? And I think there's two reasons. One is historical. Carl and Olivier's session also touched on this a bit. When the Prussians invented the system of education that is now mainstream throughout the world, not only children, even adults did not have human rights. So the Prussian king did not think, oh, my citizens need education so that they can liberate themselves, let's provide education to everybody. It was actually that they wanted to get the citizens to conform to a certain way. The citizens did not want this, so that's why it had to be paid for by public funds, and that's why they had to have compulsory education laws to force people to come to school instead of working their farms, which is what they wanted to do. So international human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights started in 1948, and this system of schooling was already about 200 years old by then. The Convention on the Rights of the Child that defined the children as having their own rights. So not just that other people guarantee their rights, but the children can defend their own rights, is only from 1989. So these practices have been in place, and for generations people have gone through those practices and consider it normal. And this is also the perception issue. So when it comes to corporal punishment, there is discourse around it. because there is some huge number of children in the world who are experiencing corporal punishment. It is the most common form of violence against children. And later this month, the WHO is launching a report on how corporal punishment is a public health crisis and how much it is costing in terms of well-being and health. We are able to make that comparison because some countries have corporal punishment and some don't. So we notice this. We wonder, why is it that those countries can manage without corporal punishment? Why do we still need to have this? When what we do in democratic education is not seen, people don't have this comparison. They're just looking at what's there in the mainstream, and that's like a little bit of participation in deciding, do I want to do maths from a textbook or maths as a project, is for them wow as participation, because they haven't seen the kind of participation that happens in democratic education. So it's like, I used to like eating waffles in Sri Lanka. And then the first time I came to Belgium, I ate a waffle in Belgium. And now that is my standard for what a waffle can be, and I can't eat waffles back in Sri Lanka anymore. Right? So we need people to come and see what it is like in democratic education, so then the bar of what they accept as possible is going to shift. So the people I mentioned before, Garrison Lansdowne, Laurel Lundy, so these are international experts in children's rights, about a child's right to be heard, about the concept of evolving capacity, how as a child matures they have more capacity to make decisions about their life. And the kind of things that they ask for is happening in democratic schools. They don't know we exist. We invite them to come for a conference and they don't bother to show up. So there's like a big, big gap. Okay, so I said I'll give some specific examples. This is from the general comment on the right to be heard from 2009, right? So this is like, 16 years ago. So this is asking the world to do these things. And, these have been happening since Zavahir, if not before, right? So for the right to education, the right of the child to be heard within education is fundamental. If you do not have the right to be heard, you cannot fulfill the child's right to education. Just because you say we have universal enrollment, it doesn't mean the right to education is fulfilled. And they are the ones who said, so the 18 experts in the world who form the Committee on the Rights of the Child, they are the ones who said, continuing authoritarianism, discrimination, disrespect, and violence is the reality of many schools and classrooms. So, this is not me. This is people who have looked at what is happening in education systems around the world have said this, but not looking at democratic schools, right? It says, in all educational environments, active role of children in a participatory learning environment should be promoted. Education authorities have to include children's and parents' views in the planning of curriculum and school programs. So we are doing this. And we have to fight with inspectors that we are doing this, because the inspector hasn't read this either. And it talks about how human rights must be practiced in the institution in which the children learn and play with other children and adults. So it can't be that we are only learning about human rights so that we can pass the civics exam, but we actually have to experience this. So we keep talking about participation of children in decision making. This general comment said, this right has to be enshrined in legislation. The country's law must recognize the right of children to participate in decision-making processes. And it can't be dependent on the goodwill of the school. So right now, in a democratic school, the fact that children have this does depend on the goodwill of the school. Because if that school shuts down and the child goes to a mainstream school, the child no longer enjoys this right. For it not to depend, then it has to be something in law that requires every school to do this. So when I said a legal problem requires a legal solution, arguing to change the law is not easy. But we don't, strictly speaking, need to do that because we need to appeal to the higher law. So in principle, education policy is below statute law. So if something in education policy is violating a law by parliament, you can challenge it. Statute law is below the constitution, so if something in the statute law violates the fundamental rights, you can challenge it. And then constitutional law is below international law. But in order to do this, we need to have the evidence to be able to say that when we do this practice, this is aligned with these rights, and this is what is happening in this school, and this school, and this school, and 50 other schools. Because then it's harder to ignore. So how are we going to do this? So this is part of the proposal that the UN approved. A rights-based school, which has autonomy, dignity, self-esteem, is where human rights are identified explicitly and distinctively for everybody as learning objectives. So it's not just something that happens by the way, but we are explicit. When we are having children or allowing children to exercise their right to be heard, when children are participating in decision making, what is happening is we are creating an environment where they can exercise their right to be heard. We need to be, we are asked to be explicit about this by this proposal. And it says there should be a rights-based quality assurance system, including a self-evaluation from the school. The learners and the educators should be directly involved in carrying out the monitoring and the evaluation processes, which I think for schools that have school meetings, this is not something hard to do. And it says there should be a resource center for collecting and disseminating good case practices. So, and also participating in service. And this can allow us to have the cultural dialogue with the mainstream schools. Because binaries don't help. If we say we're democratic and you guys, you're not democratic, that does not encourage anybody to have a conversation with us. Especially the gap is too big. Like, if you take any mainstream school and try to make it a Summerhill overnight, it's going to be crazy. That change can only come step by step. So we have actually answers to how we can do this step by step. Derry Hannon's 20% proposal, SUEME, the CHIP program in Canada, there are various ways how you can take this step by step. But when we take those programs, like, who are you to tell us to implement this program? So where is the credibility or the legitimacy for this? So the Convention on the Rights of the Child can be like this North Star that says we are all, whether we are calling ourselves democratic, whether we are calling ourselves a free school, whether we are public funded, it doesn't matter. This is something that our countries have ratified because it's important, and we should not be violating children's rights. Regardless of where we are at the moment, we can proceed towards this. So if we are a school that has corporal punishment, maybe the first step is that we work on eliminating corporal punishment. And that is more important than eliminating uniform codes or something like that, right? But I think, again, the way this process needs to work is that the young people, the rights holders, need to say what is important for us. And if we had this, then all of us can be supporting each other because we're all going in the same direction. So the reason a mainstream school should want to have more flexibility in the curriculum, more opportunities for age mixing, or any of these things is because they have a commitment towards children's rights. And especially if they are a state school, they are obliged. Like, private schools don't have to, it's sort of part of how the human rights work, but if you are a public institution, you have more obligations towards fulfilling these rights. So the reason to come to somebody who has done it is like, okay, we need to do this thing, and you guys say you know how to do this thing, so help us do this. Right? So we have a way to get there. So how? Right? Now this is the biggest challenge because we are already struggling for time. Right? To do something extra is not going to be easy. So what I say is, the basic step is actually you continue to do the work you are already doing. So whether you are talking about decolonizing, whether you are talking about decision making, whether you're talking about sociocracy, whether you're talking about restorative justice, you continue to do the work you are doing. The only extra is that we document it in terms of human rights, and we publish it on Rights-Centric education, which would be the resource center that was called for before, right? And initially, I am happy to help in how to frame this in terms of human rights. As we collect more examples, it's going to be much easier to train an AI to do it for us, where we can say, I'm doing X, Y, Z things, please look at these other examples and tell me which human rights this is aligned for. Right? And then if we have capacity to do more things, then there's plenty more things. If somebody reaches out to you and says, we want to learn how you eliminated corporal punishment, how did you deal with objections from the parents, then yes, please do support them. Look at what others are doing and see if this is something of interest to the children in your school, and if it is, then you can reach out to them and say, hey, we see that you guys are doing this, can you help us with this? If you can take another step and actually publish your plans and say, within the next 6 months, we are going to eliminate corporal punishment, then that creates a culture of accountability, because then the young people know, okay, this is the promise that has been made, these are the steps that are going to be done, and if these are not kept, we can, at least we have some basis for accountability to ask, you promised this, why have you not done this? I mean, we do the same thing with elected representatives. They make promises at elections. If they don't fulfill them, then generally at the next election they get voted out. And we can survey children on how well they believe their human rights are respected by the practices in the school. So these are, I think, things that become easier as we go, because for us, in most cases, it's not going to be doing something radically different to what we are already doing. But we just need to sort out this documentation part, then it helps all of us have more credibility, all of us to get more families coming in, all of us to get like endorsed by UNICEF, or have research on how the mental health of children in democratic schools is better than in mainstream schools. So for all of these things, we just need to really track the documentation. So, and then in future we can, once we have some examples of these things in democratic schools, we can reach out to the mainstream schools and say, guys, there's something like this, why don't you join us? Because you have an obligation to children's rights. Specifically, what's next? Tomorrow, 10 to 12 in the big room, Kathy is doing a session going deeper into fundamental rights and how they relate to freedom of education. So if you like to understand a bit more about how these claims work, the legal defense of it and things like that, join tomorrow 10 to 12. Tomorrow 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. in the Birch Room, there's a workshop kind of opportunity. So for people who want to get into the nitty-gritty of things, like how are we going to do this, whether it's the IT side or the privacy side, or I don't know, any kind of questions on the details of it, we can take it up then. And if that's not enough time, we can schedule more. We can also take time at the end here for questions, but we created this opportunity tomorrow in case there's a need for more. And yeah, you have my email and my number for WhatsApp or Signal, so if you need to connect with me after, get more details, clarify something, you can ping me. And apart from that, either at IDEC or after, so for this resource center, we have a name called Rights-Centric Education. The idea is that education is not, it's not about whether it's exam-centered or learner-centered, but it should be centered on human rights, because that is what is required for a democratic society. So we have something called the Rights-Centric Education Network, which is completely free to join. There's no obligations, membership criteria, nothing. Just that when you put your name on that, you say you are part of a movement that values human rights in education. So it's just, the more names we have on there, the more valuable it is to everybody to be part of this. There is a declaration that is a bit of a legalese kind of thing on why education practices are not aligned with children's rights and why therefore they need to change. And it's something more to engage with policymakers, organizations like UNICEF, but again, if you can sign that, that adds credibility. But the most important thing is whether you will make a commitment to be part of this quality assurance system, because if it's like 3 schools doing this, it's not going to work. Maybe we can start with 3 schools, but we need more and more people to join. And from my side, what I am willing to offer is to make this as painless as possible. So just describe the things you're doing. I will help frame it in human rights terms, and we can publish it. And if we have a critical mass of us doing this, then hopefully we can address the challenges that we saw at the start. And just a few closing thoughts. I'm going to share an example of education that is kind of really different to how things happen in schools, but let's see if you can guess this. It's available in many countries and it's mostly public funded. There is a carefully curated curriculum and it's delivered by experts, but there is no compulsory attendance. So if people find it useful and if it's accessible, they come, but if you don't come, nobody's gonna like drag you there kicking and screaming or fine you saying you're not coming or threaten to take your guardians to court. There are no exams that say, okay, you have not passed the exam for the first stage, so we're not letting you go to the second stage. There is no exam like that. There are certain diagnostic tests offered, but it's for consent, where it's like, for this reason, we think it is good if you do this test, would you like to do this test? And if you would like to do the test because you accept those reasons, you can. And it's not like what sometimes happens, that people who get the good results are tracked into the class for the high achievers, but rather the people who get the poorer results get more support. What is this education example? Sorry. No. I don't think AI is publicly funded in most places.
Hobby education. Hobby education.
Hobby?
Hobby education, like things that you after school, deliberately.
Again, that thing is, I think, usually not public funded and doesn't have a carefully curated curriculum. Like really, I think most countries have the curriculum for this. This is what happens in the first month, this is what happens in the second month, things like that. Publicly funded? Very close. So this is specifically a maternity clinic. Maternity clinic. So if you're pregnant, there are clinics that tell you these are things to watch out for, these are things to do. And the curation is important. And it has, like not doing this properly can have really adverse consequences. So it really is a problem if somebody is not coming for the clinic. But we don't force the pregnant woman to, like, you don't drag her by the hair into the class. You don't give her a test and say, oh, you failed this, you can't go to the second trimester. Right? So the difference is that an adult woman is considered to have human rights, and if you were to force them to come, it would be considered a violation. But we don't consider children to have human rights, and that's why we do all these things to children, or the mainstream does it to children. Because any of these practices, if you consider, would you do this to an adult, it doesn't make sense. It's obviously a violation if you do it to an adult, and it's only normalized for children because we don't consider children to have rights. So last thought on this. Other democratic movements were also called illegitimate, just like we are now. So if you take the abolitionists who were trying to get rid of chattel slavery, they were not considered legitimate. If you consider the suffragist movement, they were not considered legitimate. When countries like us in colonized countries wanted independence, that was not considered legitimate. And in all of those cases, what they said is the same thing that is being used against children now, right? That it's against the law, but who made the law, right? It's not the law the children made, it's the law the adults made. And they are not mature enough, they can't think for themselves, they can't figure it out, they are not ready. Right? So always in a system of oppression, the people benefiting from the oppression will try to continue that. But so the sort of closing thought that I think gives us some hope is that the people who matter most in this have spoken. In 2022, as part of the UNESCO Transforming Education Summit, there was a global survey that reached about 500,000 young people from over 170 countries. And they published the Youth Declaration on Transforming Education. And they have said, for too long, we have been excluded or only tokenistically included in the policy and decision-making processes affecting our lives, livelihoods, and futures. In transforming education, we demand that our voices be heard, our lived experiences valued, our demands addressed, and our efforts, leadership, and agency acknowledged. So it's actually quite worthwhile to read the full thing. In this, many of the things they are demanding are already happening in democratic schools. So really, we have to be at the place where we are out there as an example of human rights being lived in practice when it comes to children's rights in education. So we are already doing the work, we just need to make it more visible. So end of my talk, and now we can use whatever time for questions.
Thanks, Sifaan. That was a very thought-provoking, reflective, and very coherent, actually. And I think the argument you make is quite compelling. I like the fact that you're action-oriented. My name is John O'Reilly from Ireland. And actually, it's interesting, we have a national framework for the participation of young people in decision-making, written into our national law, and it's based on Lundy's model of participation and student voice. So I have two things, a quick reflection and then a question. So the reflection is, I think your argument is all the more propitious because it aligns very well with UNESCO's reimagining our educational futures. I think it is a new social contract for education. What's interesting within that is that they state, I'm not causing this interference, I promise, is that they state that no blueprint for change exists. I think what you've done today is put up a challenge to that. Okay, what's interesting as well is based on Lundy's analysis of Article 12 of the Charter of the Rights of the Child, she notes that it's not within the gift of teachers to allow students to make these kinds of decisions, but rather it is a legal imperative. So here's my question. You mentioned coming at this from a legal point of view. I think that's compelling. But we all know, and especially our American friends, that the law is not so straightforward and can be subject to challenge, right? And I have found in my reading, in my own experience, that one of the major issues, and these vary from context to context, culture to culture, is the kind of paradigmatic assumptions that we hold about things. So you had a good quote on the end there around attitudes about student capability, especially very young children. And again, Lundy argues, look, the Article 12 doesn't say they must be able to form a fully mature decision before they are allowed to make a fully mature position before they are allowed to make decisions. They should be, if they can articulate anything at all, they should be making them. But many teachers would take the view that to put students in a position to make these decisions, it's overly challenging. They have almost paternalistic or maternalistic views of the child, which of course then become widespread in the system, so that the students themselves hold this position. In that way, it's kind of like a hegemonic assumption. You don't see your own disenfranchisement. So I agree that trying to compile an evidence base of rights-centric education is very strong argument. But many teachers would say, oh yes, I would do that. But the system and the students, they're not really capable of this. So how also do you start to address those core, long-held, deeply embedded beliefs and assumptions? To not just to challenge, but actually to support teachers in potentially a very vulnerable position to say, hey, all these years I've been doing this quite wrongly, you know? It's a very long question. Give me an answer in a single sentence, please.
Yes, educational paternalism, or sometimes I call it saviorism, is quite a challenge, because if you look back at where these people came from, quite probably it was in a school system where they were indoctrinated in a way that you are not capable, you are only succeeding because I, as a teacher, am teaching you well and you should be grateful and all of these things. And that is the mainstream view in society. That's the same thing you get when you go to your teacher training, that because children can't do this for themselves, you have to do this. And whether confronting that head on is suitable or not, I don't know. I think there needs to be some pathway to... Okay, let's look at it from this perspective. Imagine I could design a training program. You put a mainstream teacher with this paternalistic savioral ideas in, and out comes a democratic teacher, right? Even if we could design the training experience, I think it would not be democratic to make somebody go through that process. Like, if you're saying we should not do this to children, we should not be doing it to adults either. But how can we offer this in a way that makes it accessible, makes it palatable, but also in the meantime supports children to be in a position where their rights are not being violated by this. I think the way to get there would be actually the smaller steps, like, okay, you think that children can't make decisions like this, but if you don't actually allow this to happen in any way at all, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So how about we try it out in this way, in these number of pilot schools, and we try this, Derry Hannam's 20% proposal or something like that, and then we see the results, and then we take it from there. And the reason for doing those, I think, needs to be not that when we do it this way, we get better exam results. When we do age mixing, we have better school attendance. No, we do this because it is the right, and we have an obligation to respect the rights. So I think we need to use that rights language. You want to add something, Don?
Yeah. Am I on? Okay. This is part of where that distinction between the marketing language, the political language, and the technical language actually could be a really useful way to think about this. Because if you're thinking about those deeply held beliefs and values, then he's addressing the political solution, which is actually a kind of blend of technical and marketing. But what you're addressing is something that requires that marketing stuff. And by marketing, I don't mean just selling. I mean a language that's emotive and engaging in positive ways, not just negative ways. And so that's where storytelling and a variety of, like some of the collecting the stories of the students and things like that is helping people to start to chip away at it, not from a mandated point of view, but from a, look, this is the experiences these kids are having, compare it to your own. I've never met a teacher, and I've gone to conferences all over the world, and from the mainstream to the democratic, I've never met a teacher who didn't get it, who didn't understand that there was a problem, but they see the constraints. And so that's where having these different levels of conversation is, there needs to be the appeal. You're caring for children. They need to understand that conversation. You're an educator, you're an instructor, and you need to be able to have a conversation there. And you're an agent of the state, and you have obligations in this realm of rights. All those conversations need to be together, and they need to start to coordinate and see together.
Sorry, actually, so we should ask. That's very. Oops. How come it doesn't do this for you? I would ask though, Don, like, I mean, okay, it's a political consideration to position it in legal terms. Mm-hmm. And as I said, that was my point of making, is all legal terms are subject to challenge. And for someone to argue that I've tried to do this, but because of the constraints or whatever, it's become impossible for me to do so, you know? And I just think there's such cultural variation from place to place that... Can you hear me? Yeah. That ultimately someone can say, actually, I am doing my best for the rights of the child here, because if I put them in too challenging a position, this will be perplexing and upsetting to them. Mm-hmm. And ultimately they haven't, I think this is the real kind of fulcrum upon which this all turns. In our country, there's a state examination at the end of this. And if I prioritize your views, opinions, perspectives, and I do so authentically, you will be disadvantaged in this state examination system. Mm-hmm. And that thing you want for your future life and that your parents want will no longer occur. So I'm with you, Don, like in terms of the power of persuasion that way. Right. But I find that the inertial nature of the system and its existing kind of structures and constraints makes it so hard to sell that beyond saying something like, well, we all agree that rights are important. Right. But unfortunately,
right. And that's where I think the like I said, there's distinctions in the language we can use. So when we go to a teacher in the mainstream, I can talk to them as a psychologist about primary needs. That's universal, and that sidesteps some of these legal restraints. Like, they already have that obligation. They have the obligation to take care of the child. And if I can show that, in fact, there's ways we can do this a little differently, they can start at their level and say, oh, okay, I can be a little more autonomy supportive. I can be a little more, build relationship in my classroom. And so there are small steps. All I'm saying is it also has to coordinate with multiple levels.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree. It needs to be a socio-ecological kind of spanning from the supra down. This doesn't work.
I'd like to add a perspective, because at least in Austria, we have the legal foundation to create democratic education. Yeah. We only maybe have a problem with grades. I don't know how to solve that. Yeah. But we have school laws that roll out the golden plate to be a lot of the democratic education. Mm-hmm. But headmasters, teachers, parents, stakeholders in education don't know this law at all, or at least a lot. They always say, it's not working, but it's really starting with the law, how you need to elect the class representatives, for example. It really starts there. It's like how these elections every year come across. It's horrible, because in some classes, like teachers say, oh, you have been elected last year, just do it again. Yeah. Like, what the fuck? And even, it's when it's not even possible to do these simple participatory actions, it's really hard to, or another thought, I think we really need to create experiences for adults, for teachers, for headmasters, for especially parents, to to experience what democratic education is and how it feels, and how it touches your heart, and that it's possible, and that you are heard, that they can actually trust in that.
Exactly.
And I'm a school development consultant and a facilitator, and I facilitated a round of the most engaged headmasters in my region, together with the politicians from the 5 parties in our country who are responsible for education. And we tried to make a consent for 10 main statements which this group of headmasters created to create more transformation. And I tried to facilitate actually the consent, and there was one point where 2 of the parties, you can guess who, dropped out of the conversation. And it was so scary because when it came to the conversation about the grades, and that especially in primary school we should not grade kids, one of the politicians said, really, I don't believe that grading is good. And that's from a politician, you know? From one who once was a teacher, and really, and I was really trying to be very professional in this way, but that's the kind of politicians we have, you know? And therefore, I think we really need to, of course, create a society where we vote the right parties. But I'm really stuck in where we actually can create this, because we have the laws, but we don't have the people who have this experience. So after IDEC last year, which was my first, I was like, where are the democratic schools for adults? Because I want to experience that kind of learning.
Yes.
Because then I actually know what I'm supporting to.
Right. And that's where the what I call marketing language, what I mean is not salesy, but that emotion, that conveying, like there's a project to collect the stories of graduates of democratic schools, and I think that's fabulous. And if we can start to have those be collected and then start to weave them together into this fabric of some, that emotional, like I feel like, oh yeah, we want these adults to be saying, I wish I had that, you know, because they didn't. And having an experience that actually taps that in some way. And there are elements, even in the mainstream schools, at least in the US, all the optional things, all the theater classes and those things that they opt into are the places where you can point to that and say that is the kind of experience that actually is normal in a democratic school and on an everyday basis, not as an outlier and it's a thing you have to do all the other stuff to get to. Like you just do that all the time. So having them being able to draw those stories together, I think is really crucial. And this is one element, but we need these other elements as well.
I was looking for something that came up about the state exams. So this is an area, because it's about, usually in countries you have some kind of graduation exam that limits your opportunities for further education. Right? And the reason that exam exists is actually to limit opportunities. It's to be able to say, okay, these people can get to be doctors, these people get to be engineers, and eventually somewhere down the line, these people get to be the sanitary workers. So it's like this massive sorting hat that decides who get to be where. So it's a special area of concern when it comes to children's right to be heard, but this is like a massive level of change in how higher education is organized if we had to actually realize the right to education for everybody and not to create this competition in schools that then forces children to have to perform and jump through all these hoops so that they can get the desirable higher education. And about grading, I think grading is fundamentally, what's the word? Degrading, right? Because what is graded are commodities. So you can have oil graded, you can have copper graded, but human beings are not commodities and we should not be graded. there should be ways where people can get feedback and say, I am struggling with driving or swimming or maths or whatever it is, and I would like you to help me figure out what I can do to get better at this, but don't brand me with a grade that is going to be attached to my life. And I'll give a different example that shows really how degrading this is. So supposedly these grades tell us how suitable somebody is to do something, right? So if you have grade A in economics, you are going to be expected to be good at economics. If you have a grade C in maths, then maybe we shouldn't be trusting you to do the maths. So that's what the grading does, right? Now, most women in the world will have children. Right? The numbers may be reducing, but a large number of women are going to have children. Imagine if we lived in a society that graded women on their ability to bear children. So that before we chose a partner, men could say, oh, you're only a grade C, like, okay, maybe not. Right? But if we have the premise that we need grading so that we can see who is suitable for what purpose, then we ought to do it there as well. But it's obvious there that this is degrading to do to somebody. Right? And in the same token, for anything, if we are imposing a grade on children, it is, I think, degrading and should not happen anyway.
Okay, so I think that we can talk about it with the children and tell them about it doesn't really matter the grades. Right now they exist. The reason they exist is this and that, and don't worry about it. And to have a discussion about it. Rather than saying yes or no, we can just inform them, because this is the world we live in. It's full of grades. If they grow up with zero idea of what grade is, when they finish school, they will say, what is going on here? I'm saying like the step-by-step process. Until one day we will not have grades. This is one point. The other is that in Greece we want to make finally the first democratic school, and even though it's not legal to be public, we're thinking about starting with private. And so I wonder if I should ask something now, or it's a bigger topic. My question is so open. It's like if it's okay to make like a private, have a private building and with connection with IDEC to name democratic, or actually it's a wide question. If you have any experience that you can share, how to open a democratic school in a country that doesn't have.
Is the question asked? Because I couldn't hear. Sorry. Has the question been asked? Because I couldn't hear properly. Do you mind sharing it?
Problem is, if he wants, stop. Don't put it in front of the speakers. That's the problem with the feedback. If you want to ask your question, you can go to the stage and then I can give you a mic.
I asked that how can we start a democratic school in a country that didn't have democratic schools before, like Greece? This is my question.
Start it. Just, sorry, I don't mean to be facetious, because I don't have a fully democratic school, right? But I'm in the gray. But I started one, and it's the first and only one in where I live in the Bahamas. I only have 12 kids. I started with 5, and we're figuring it out as we go. And I'm still, 7 years later, I'm still waiting right now for government approval. I have been in front of them and telling them what I am doing to the best of my ability. And in some ways I've had to compromise to meet their standards, but I started it. Just start it. Find some parents who are interested and just 2 or 3 kids. And it will, because every time people come to me and they ask me about my school and I tell them what we do, they say this thing: I wish I had that when I was young. Almost every time. I had that when I was young.
I had it in this school.
Yes. Yeah. And I would venture to say, my point there is, where you live, those people are there also. Mm-hmm. And you will have stakeholders who will join in this vision with you if you just start it. I'm here. I'm my number for conversation. I would love to be a voice in the dark for you if you want to talk more. Truly.
Thank you.
Yeah, perhaps I can add a little story here as well, because I was connecting with what you said, that there are always people that want to follow. Mm-hmm. And
so can you stand up, because then your voice will carry it.
Oh, yeah, sorry. So I wanted to connect with the idea that people, that there are always people that want to follow the vision and share that. Because when I was coming here by train, I was having this conversation with people in the train because we were bored. And I was telling them, oh, I'm going to this democratic school conference. And they said, like, oh, interesting, tell me more about it. So I was explaining how democratic schools make children more responsible because they are participating in making laws, and not laws, but like rules, and participating how projects should be done. And the woman actually said, like, oh my God, this is what this time needs. This is what society needs right now. And then she told her story as a book, like an accountant, or administration accountant, something like that. That when she gets students from secondary school to have an internship with her, they are very demotivated, and that she also, in her way, started with, what do you like to do, I will tell you what I am doing and why we are doing it. And in that way, these students also, in the end of the day, were doing things that they thought they wouldn't like to do, but because they knew the reasons why, and they were listened to, and they could think for themselves what they like to do, it worked. And this is like just how people connect with the idea what is being done in democratic schools. And everyone has their own unique story and differences in what they find important in it, but there is a lot of things that people can agree on, and it's the art to find those things and see what brings life to people.
Just to add something from the right-centric perspective to your question, so the human rights angle is more useful if you have to deal with like a school inspector or a school authority who is questioning why are you starting this school, and then to bring it in. It's probably not a useful reason to give parents on why they should enroll the child in the school. That's then more of a marketing question, but that's sort of a separate angle. But even if it's not part of the marketing equation, I think it should still be part of the language in the school that we compare what we do with rights, because if we don't, we are actually sort of complicit in allowing those rights to be violated. Right? Because children can defend their rights only if they are aware of those rights, and if the people around them are not making an effort to provide education on those rights. If we think that reading and writing and maths are the most important things and knowing about your rights are not important, then I think we're doing a disservice. So that should come in, but the argument on it would be more for policymakers or authorities and not so much for the parents.
I can also add to what you said with the companies. also in my region in Austria, there is the initiative since 2016 where someone gathered all the responsible people for the apprentice to ask how can we address the learning path of the apprentice towards the future, and more that they get more motivated and that they have good staff. And I think that's also a good conversation or a good starting point in a region, because then you also include the industries and the different working places, because they are in need of good workers. Then you also have the politics involved, because we have a corrupt system whatsoever. And then you have people in favor for the kind of education.
Also, go ahead.
There's an online question.
Okay, am I far enough from the speakers? Yes, I am. All right, the question goes as follows. In Sri Lanka and elsewhere in the world too, the majority is not sensitized to right-centered approaches. It seems a domain of political activities, etc. And political activism is often met with scorn and yeah, but there's a letter missing. Illegitimized by such people. Therefore, while working on a bottom-up approach to develop and report on a QAS, it is important to also go top-down, I feel. How can we engage, for example, powerful NGOs like Child's Right Connect, who supports UNICEF with UNCRC, based on Switzerland, UNICEF to support the RCEQAS. How do we get this center in their agenda?
Thank you so much for this question.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, this is a challenge for any aspect of human rights. Unless the rights holders are acting to defend the rights, then the duty bearers, the state, just forgets that they have a responsibility. They forget that they ratified these treaties. So it's part of a larger political space, I think, in a way, that how do we agitate for these things. And I think in terms of engaging with places like UNICEF or engaging with the Committee on the Rights of the Child, some people will have the appetite to do that or the connections to do that, but even for them to do it, I think we need to have the evidence from the ground that this is what is happening in X number of schools. And because right now I could say, okay, this happens like in Henning School or this happens in Mike's school, but if somebody else like, okay, show me some evidence that this is happening, do I just have to take your word for it? So if we actually have that documentation, then it's possible to say that this is how we have improved, this is what the surveys that children have given are saying, and it gives something to take to Laura Lundy, it takes something to take to UNICEF. So if we get this going, then the possibilities are there. But without this, I think we are just going to go there like some hippies or something like that who don't have any data to back things up. So yeah, that part of the battle also needs to be had. But even for that, we need to sort out the evidence at our level.
Actually, I think picking up on that, Sifaan, and responding to the question, which needed a few more acronyms, by the way. But Dom, what you were saying about marketing, right? Rather than necessarily even coming at this from an adversarial point of view to legally challenge the denial of these rights, I do a lot of work with policymakers in Ireland. A lot of these people actually want to realise these things, but because of the constraints and the assumptions, they just can't see that it's possible. Mm-hmm. So if there is a persuasive approach drawing on the evidence from schools within your country, not other countries, frankly, I mean, that has a certain element of persuasion, but there's such cultural variation. Even here today, I was at a talk just before in Belgium. I don't know if there are Belgian people here, but like, Belgian teachers assess their own students all the way to the point of the end of secondary schools. In my country, teachers have openly said, teachers cannot be trusted to do this because they will cheat, and they will say their students are doing better for the purposes of terminal exams that determine college entries. You see, that's just a quick example of a massive difference. So I think actually, if we can develop an evidence base, as you're saying, that actually shows to policymakers that these lofty ambitions are actually practical, they're realizable within this state, I think that will go a long way towards persuading them that this right, and it looks good, doesn't it? Look at us supporting children's rights. Yeah.
I mean, it can be done with less violence, and it can be done with less money.
One more thought. Is it possible that children sue the state because in school they're violating
The rights of violence,
Technically, yes. In countries that have ratified the third optional protocol of the CRC, which I think is quite a number of countries in Europe, if a child's right is violated in the country, they can complain directly to the Committee on the Rights of the Child. But you have to exhaust domestic opportunities first. You basically have to sue your country or whatever or the education authority in courts, take it up to the Supreme Court if necessary, and only when that fails can you do this. So, by this time the child is maybe not a child anymore, so there's a problem in doing it this way, but technically it can be done. And I don't know, sometimes I think there needs to be a case, Anna, I can't remember her surname, but it was a Hungarian woman, because Hungary was introducing or had introduced a law that said if a doctor assists a woman to give birth at home, the doctor will face criminal prosecution or charges. And she challenged that in the European Court of Human Rights, saying that she has a right to give birth at home and you cannot violate this right by criminalizing the practice, and she won. And because she won, all women under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights won the right to give birth at home if they wanted. So maybe there needs to be some landmark case like this that sets the precedent, that then just moves the needle all at once. But I don't think anybody's going to volunteer to do that, so it's going to be tricky.
Well, I hope that someone will. I work in mainstream school, I'm a school leader in a mainstream school, and I think I'm interested in mainstream change while hugely valuing democratic as part of the community. My feeling is that things can change very, very quickly. It's very simple. At the point where school leaders believe that it is in their vested interest to make a change, because otherwise they face all sorts of risk, because school leaders are highly risk averse. If they believe that there is greater risk from going against children's rights than there is from a reduction in grades, then they will immediately change their process. If I'm in the UK has a school system that is divided up amongst the increasingly small number of academy chains, which means it's actually very, very simple. At the point where there is a policy, is where the human rights policies that we're talking about here are being taken seriously because the courts are saying that the government must, then the environment would change almost overnight. And then what would happen is that the more forward-thinking school leaders, and those from the democratic sector as well, would be given huge opportunities to have a say on what the new nature of schools would look like. It wouldn't be difficult, but it needs that first thing. But school leaders will never change. Risk averting within school leaders means that you'll never get the impetus unless that there is this legal action. That's why I'm really excited by what you've said today, because I'm on the bridge between these two spaces, and I cannot see until this conversation how the hell this could grow in a meaningful way. But it's made me think, we've seen US examples of where segregation in schools has been ended through, well, to an extent, through court cases going to the Supreme Court. It doesn't seem implausible to me. I can't really see another mechanism for things to happen on scale that's not actually legal in nature.
It's not necessarily, sorry, it's not necessarily a direct response, but kind of. It's something I wanted to say earlier. In my culture, in the Caribbean, I can say, children are property, yeah? And without a value judgment, I will say that the country that I am in is deeply religious. And they have a certain worldview that people are inherently bad, even from the moment that they are born, and therefore cannot remotely be trusted. This, I feel, is what not me, but me. This is what I would be up against if I were trying to come from a human rights perspective, because in that culture, children, ratified or not, culturally, those children have no rights. And they certainly don't have the right to be heard, because I still very much live in a children should barely be seen and definitely not heard kind of society. And so I don't even know where to begin, where I feel optimistic about your views of risk averseness changing, leaders' ideology. In my country, we're 150 government schools serving 50,000 children, grossly understaffed, and just heavily burdened. And then against that is, you do what we say when we say, because you can't make any choices for yourself. I don't even know where to begin with that. And that's, I don't have a question. I really am just like mass therapy. I don't know how to deal with that as a cultural more. And we're not alone. I think that's true in other communities as well. Rights of children is just not a thing where I come from.
So sometimes these human rights approaches also take a roundabout way. So all this time, the approach to ending corporal punishment in the world has been taking a certain approach, but the idea that it is actually a public health crisis is something that is new. So if for example, it could be shown that when children are participating in making decisions, the engagement is more, their learning is more, the exam results are more. I don't really like using rights as a tool to get somewhere else. I would rather rights be on top, but then maybe that sort of idealism doesn't help the rights get anywhere at all. And maybe the practical way to get rights happen is to actually look at the benefits that at least the parents see in their children. So whatever else is going on, like because I want a better outcome for my child, let me go with this. That may be a way to start. And I think the other thing that hopefully will come out of this is that how to get to a certain place is very much dependent on the kind of culture and starting point we have. So it may be more useful, let's say, for you to look at a similar example in Sri Lanka than it is to look at Belgium, because the starting points are so different. Yeah. So I'm not even sure if Sri Lanka is very similar, but I think it's more similar than, say, mainland Europe. So to be able to look at examples that are closer to the same starting point, so then I will ask that person for help rather than somebody who had a different starting point. And then we need to have the diversity of those examples.
Is there any catalog of these examples?
We're trying to build it.
A manual on how to start a democratic school.
There are some resources for that.
Yes.
The Alternative Education Research Organization, educationuniversity.org. They have a course. Somebody else had one. The ALC, they have kind of a some guidance that.
Also, Sudbury Valley School had a couple of books on it.
Mm-hmm. So yes, there are resources.
They are like in their
I will find related to note this.
Yeah, yeah. And I would also, to further your point, the couple of IDECs ago, there was a group of Greek people in similar desire. So if you don't know them, you need to find them and find out where they're at, and maybe they're having to fly under the radar, or maybe they're running into roadblocks that you should know about. But find a network here with people who've been to many IDECs and figure out who the Greek people are.
Or maybe you'll find that those Greek people have disappeared.
I know them all. I know them all.
Okay, anything? One more there? Okay.
Yeah, we have another online question. Let's see. How can we mobilize children themselves, the right holders? How to get them more engaged and raise awareness amongst them so that these duty bearers cannot ignore to pay attention?
So the crucial thing is that children need to be aware of their rights, because if you are not aware of your rights, you don't know when they're being violated. And it may not be sufficient because you may recognize that it's violated but be too scared to do something about it, but the absolute necessary first step is to be aware of it. And I'm not sure what the number is, maybe 34 or 42 or something, but there is an article in the Convention on the Rights of the Child that says it's the duty of the state to educate children and adults about the Convention, and this has largely not happened. When Sri Lanka ratified the Convention in 1991, still they're talking about introducing it into the syllabus. And unfortunately in Sri Lanka, when they introduce it in the syllabus, it will mean that if a child does not know that Article 19 is the right to be free from violence, they'll be made to go and stand in the sun or something like that. But even if it's learning about human rights, that's kind of like a first step. Because a long time ago, that's what even the UN was recommending. And then later they realized that's not enough. You have to actually have it in your lived experience. But even for somebody to complain about it, they need to know. So maybe still the starting point is there, and we need to move from there. And I think more than that sort of academic kind of teaching about it, the more stories we have where children can see that this is how it's happening in other schools, and why can't it be like that here? And for that we may need to look at how we document what we collect in ways that are more accessible to young people, so in terms of the language, in terms of whether it's video, so those kind of things, maybe something we can add that makes it possible for the rights holders to defend themselves. I think another infiltration strategy is to have student unions, because when there's a collective, then it feels less scary to take a stand on issues. So maybe there needs to be some reasoning given to why to have this student union, but we have it, like in Sri Lanka, we have it in universities. Why can we not have it in schools? And certain things they can be involved in, and then once they are able to show that they can engage meaningfully in those ways, then they can agitate for more and more things. So that might be something to try.
What is your attitude towards UNICEF as a rights promoting organization? Like what is their role in these issues? What have you learned about them?
So the UN overall has a tricky position, I would say, because they can't enforce things on member states. So they can, if the government, like say, if the government in Sri Lanka asks UNICEF, help us to do some training programs around eradicating corporal punishment, then UNICEF can come. UNICEF cannot come with a big stick and say, you have ratified the CRC and why are you not doing this? So they can't. Then the government will tell UNICEF to get lost. So it's always, I think, with any UN agency, it's that sort of tough place to be because you cannot impose. The UN mandate does not really support that. At best they will like statements of we are deeply concerned about this and we are closely monitoring this and things like that. But if states reach to them for help and then if they have the funding they can do it. And I think where we need to go with UNICEF is for UNICEF to say that when it comes to respecting children's rights in education, these are the good cases that the state can refer to. So talk to these people and they can help you do this. So if we can get UNICEF to do that, then I think it's like that endorsement by UNICEF is like massive.
So, you know they have the Rights-Centric Schools initiative, right? And that's the program for the developed countries, and then they have a parallel program which I can't remember the name of for developing countries. Are you familiar with those programs and how they work?
I'm only familiar with the one in the UK and or in England. I'm not sure. I think it's in all of UK. And I think while their explanation of how respecting children's rights leads to overall better outcomes in a variety of ways is a good mapping, I think it's unfortunate that they don't have the funding, so basically the school has to pay to be part of it. And I think that then creates an access gap which should not be there. And it is UNICEF who is coming and inspecting the school and making a determination of which level you are at, which I think is also flawed because it should be the rights holders who are making the determination, which is what is there in the documentation as well. Because, anytime you have some external party come in to make the inspection, then you're going to dress things up to pass the inspection. Right? This is like in, Soviet era, how if there was an inspection on a place like this, the grass would be painted green. Right? So children would be coached on what to say when the inspectors come and things like that. And it's, maybe a useful starting point, but I think needs to go much further where that evaluation is done by the children themselves and they have access to what's happening in other places. We want to go to this school and see how their school meeting is run. And we want to go to this school and see how their justice committee has been done. And like, hey, this is, not at all what it was projected to be. I don't think these guys are doing it really well. We wouldn't want this in our place or something like that. And I think we need to move to that. So if UNICEF could enable a program like that, I think it would be, a bottom-up one would be much better.
It's always good to propose to UNICEF something because they have toolkits and whatsoever. And I suddenly found my toolkit for the socio-democratic election of class representatives in the toolkit for more participatory actions. Yeah. Like, wow! So it helps to, for example, say, okay, hey, there's a proposal, or hey, there are things that we do. Please take it in consideration to put it on your awesome.
I just also remembered something from that I thought of before but forgot to say. At the moment, with rights-centric education, we are more concentrating on the rights of children because this is what is sort of violated wholesale by mainstream education. But we can also look at the rights of children with disabilities, which becomes a kind of special case when it comes to especially invisible disabilities and how that is sort of Ian made this point yesterday that in any other place, if somebody is called special, it means it's good. But special needs means something entirely else. So like it's kind of discriminatory terminology there. So that can be like a special case. There can be cases where, for example, rights of migrant or refugee children become a special focus That is not important for other places. But there's also the aspect of the rights of educators as well. Right? So in Finland, the country that is acclaimed as having the best education system, most teachers don't have job security because they are on fixed term contracts. Because the school would rather pay them for 9 months and then 3 months let the unemployment benefits take care of it rather than having them on a permanent contract. In Sri Lanka, there was a program on mindfulness for school principals, and basically the letter to the principals was that we have organized a program to instill mindfulness in you, and therefore you are required to report to this 3-day residential program on this day. How can somebody decide to instill mindfulness on anybody?
After which you will be mindful.
And if you're not, we'll send you again.
And the beatings will continue until you are mindful.
Right? So if educators are not being treated by the system in a way that their human rights are respected, how are they going to know what it's going to look like to respect the rights of young people, right? All right. Okay. So let me just, once we end, I'll just put my number up in case you didn't get it. So anybody who wants to talk more can contact me, and otherwise 10 to 12 tomorrow in the big room we have Kathy's session, and 2 to 4 in the Birch room I will be there again. So anybody who wants to go into more details of it. Thank you very much.